Okay, welcome everyone. I think it's time now to slowly get started with this final plenary session. I'm very happy to see you all here for these wonderful two speakers that we have to close off the conference program for this year. My name is Mariëlle Wijermars. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the Aleksanteri-instituutti, as well as a conference coordinator for this year's Aleksanteri Conference. It is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers, Professor Stephen Hutchings and Dr. Mälksoo. So first we'll have a paper from Dr. Mälksoo. She is a senior lecturer in international security at the Brussels School of International Studies, University of Kent, where she convenes the MA in International Conflict and Security and serves as the Director of Research and Ethics. She's the author of, among others, The Politics of Becoming European, a study of Polish and Baltic post-Cold War security images, published by Routledge in 2010. And her work on European security politics, transnational justice, liminality, memory wars, and memory laws has appeared in leading international studies journals, as well as various edited volumes. And this talk will be on the topic of the return of Eastern Europe as a normative threat. So now I invite Mariëlle Mälksoo.
Thanks very much, Mariëlle, for the kind words of introduction. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and definitely an honor to be here. I'm delighted that I've been invited into this esteemed company of full professors, so I realized that I need to quickly and seriously up my game in order to actually deserve to be in this company. The more things change, the more they stay the same. On surface, post-Cold War evolutionary curve from the high hopes of thoroughly transforming the formerly Soviet-bound Central and East European region to the recent re-emergence of anxiety about Central East European states and, of course, certain Central East European states' subtle subversion of the European order and way of life has been nothing short of extraordinary. The combination of undemocratic developments in Hungary and Poland and a general lack of enthusiasm of the Central and East Europeans for solidary burden sharing at the height of the refugee crisis or migration crisis in Europe have brought back the familiar tropes of Eastern Europeans as not quite like us, as cunning schemers and adamant nationalists for some, and troublemakers for the European unity and peace for others. So in various guises and after intense decades of Europeanization and democratization, one could say that Eastern Europe has reappeared as a challenge to the European normative order and the European Union's sense of security in the public, in the political and academic discourse, particularly in relation to the rise of illiberal governance in the region and, of course, the populist reactions to the recent migration crisis in Europe, something that we've all been discussing, actually, throughout these 3 days here. Now, of course, the intuitive question to ask is, why is this happening? What makes Central and Eastern Europe a particular cause for concern amongst the many struggles the European Union is currently facing, or only just beginning to recover from, if you think of the euro crisis or the migration crisis and the related solidarity crisis and the rise of far-right and populist politics and parties, not just in the region, but actually all over Europe, and last not least, of course, Brexit. So what I would like to do in my 25 minutes or so is to dig deeper for the reasons of the forceful return and reification of what we could call the mimetic wall between Eastern Europe and Europe, by way of thinking through the relationship between, and it's a mouthful, ontological security, ontological insecurity, normative threats, and liminality. And let me just explain each of these terms in turn. So essentially, I'd like to put forth 3 main propositions in the good old Christian Trinitarian tradition. So first, the so-called problem with Eastern Europe highlights the cross-pollination within this proposed conceptual triangle of mine. So first, we get the concept of ontological security, or a sense of confidence or trust about the basic existential parameters of self and social identity. And then there is, of course, the notion of ontological insecurity, the lack of that confidence, the lack of that security as being, the lack of that trust. So it's a mirror notion of ontological security. And both of them are, of course, synergistic with this concept that comes from an American political scientist, Ingrid Kreppel, the notion of normative threat, which she defines as a promise of harm to the political body through defiance of basic principles of order and right that constitute one's group. So what normative threats do, they explicitly disturb an actor's security as being by generating anxiety and portending harm for their potential to introduce an alternative and possibly indeed a very potent order. Due to the hypothetical power of normative threats to unsettle a particular order, and that order might be internal order or external, it might be retrospective or prospective, normative threats, of course, have this distinctly ontological insecurity generating clout. Now, they also are dreaded precisely because of their promise to upend, to capsize something fundamental, holding that specific political body together, along with dislocating terms of relationships among that polity and its counterparts in the world at large. Now, to make this conceptual bundle even more complicated, I would like to add into this the notion of liminality as an in-between condition, which of course entails challenges both for the figures and groups that are suspended in the transitional state, as well as for those who define the boundaries of the so-called normal state and the transition thereof. And therefore, I think liminality adds a further critical nuance to our understanding of the functioning of political communities and the normative orders they seek to sustain. So what I do in this particular paper, I draw on the classical works by Viktor Törner, political anthropologist, cultural anthropologist, and more recently a Turkish scholar, Bahar Rumelili. And I maintain that liminal groups illuminate the limits and contradictions of a structure currently in place through their very anti-structural qualities and order upending potential. So liminal actors are by definition ontologically upsetting for the guardians of the existing order. They highlight the existing order's limits and constraints, and they entail a promise of an alternative order. Crisis and social change do not just represent the manifestation of power relations, as Dirk Navers argues, but they also bring forth the opportunity of the reversal of the present relations by unraveling rather than reproducing the existing structure or the existing order. So I guess you get a sense about where this is all leading to. What I want to suggest is that this unfolding conflict of values between the liberal European mainstream and the Central and East European populist governments and ideologues who are unapologetically focused on their national sovereignty and national values, it appears to be particularly disturbing for the European Union's positive sense of self, precisely for this normative challenge's emergence from within the cohort of these new Europeans who are now evidently rebelling against their designated position of meek converts into the liberal inclusionary norms of the EU Convention. And what I find particularly applicable from this theoretical work by Ingrid Kreppel, the two subtypes of this notion of normative order, normative threat, namely transgression and subversion, seem to be particularly illuminating for understanding the contemporary East European predicament. So they prompt grievance and elicit insecurity, respectively, for a fear of being overrun by another that is perceived to be endangering one's particular normative order of things. So normative threats, such as currently the re-emergence of Eastern Europe as a normative threat trope, they function as harbingers of dreaded change in the accustomed ways of life and expectations about the rules governing relationships within a community. Now, the main fronts of this discursive battleground of the unfolding European Kulturkampf, if you will, include on the one side the official bespeakers of Europe, So you have the European Parliament, you have the Venice Commission, you have the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, you have the EU federalists, the usual suspects, the anti-populists of various feathers, and of course you have the academic critics of illiberal models of governance in Central and East Europe. I put just two most vocal out there, Kim Lane-Scheppel and Jan-Werner Müller from Princeton University. And of course also the Western European media, mainstream popular icons such as Bono of U2, all highly critical of the brand of Europe propounded by the Eastern Front. Hungary's Viktor Orban, Poland's Jarosław Kaczynski. So on this side you would have the ideological explicators and mnemonic warriors of this particular Eastern discursive circle, who would voice their pro-nation, anti-EU, and often very openly anti-Muslim immigration sentiments. So among them you would also have, for instance, Maria Schmidt, who is the director of the Terror Haza Museum in Budapest, and one of the ideological explainers of Viktor Orban to the rest of the world, in conjunction with the liberal free speech campaigners, who seek to serve as sympathetic interpreters in the supposed act of miscommunication between the two sides, whilst, of course, not forgetting to accuse the West European states or the European Union of double standards vis-à-vis the East. And who I have in mind here is Professor Frank Furedi, the emeritus professor of my own alma mater, University of Kent, in sociology, who recently published a book, Populism and the European Culture Wars, the conflicts of values between Hungary and the EU. Okay, so far so good. But my second point, the return of Eastern Europe as a problem or a threat trope also marks the reactivation of a well-sedimented framework of intelligibility regarding the region. And this becomes quite evident when we make a concise cut into the shifting scripts of Eastern Europe, from the early post-Cold War era to the recent recurrence of these popular connotations of Central and East European countries, with the normative breaches of or the looming potential to profoundly endanger the European order in spe. So what I want to say is that the convergence of Eastern Europe's historically liminal position in Europe's self-definition, with a growth, very objective growth of populist nationalist politics in certain key states of the region, amplifies the power of the socially and politically perceived normative threat in question. So Hungary's and Poland's challenge to liberal democracy as a constitutive norm of the European community, and more broadly the Visegrad states' distinct takes on solidarity as a core value of the EU in the context of handling the migration surge are, of course, key moments here. And thirdly, and of course relatedly, I believe that normative threat Eastern Europe, if you want to sort of find another side of the coin for normative power Europe, brings to bear on the topic of populism the nostalgia for a past state of the European community as a more tight-knit and unreservedly Western affair. Populism, of course, again, something that we have been discussing here quite extensively, is generally depicted as an eroding force of the normative essence of the contemporary European polity, for its targeting of liberal democratic membership norms and its aberration of the pertinent political culture of consensus building through deliberation that aims and seeks to achieve inclusive diversity. What is curious about the Central and East European states and Central and East Europeans in this context is that they concurrently emerge as the objects of populist politics, as in the context of Brexit, for instance, and the broader European debates displaying fear and aversion towards the phantom figure of the Polish plumber as a symbol of West European welfare chauvinism. So they appear as the objects of populism, but also as the embodiments of populism, depicting themselves non-native elements as fundamentally threatening to the nation state, to themselves. So that is also the reason why very often people like Orban and also the political leaders from the Czech and Slovak republics are widely held responsible for generating much of the moral panic related to the most recent migration/refugee crisis in Europe. Now, when I outline these discursive struggles, of course, all of this is not to be and not to sound, hopefully, placating of the valid concerns, very valid concerns and criticism about the very real unreeling of central democratic principles and values in Hungary and Poland, such as the infringements on the separation of powers, the rule of law, media and academic freedom, and civil society organizations in recent years. Nor do I, of course, wish to mollify the very questionable record of Visegrad states in contributing to the handling of the refugee crisis in Europe. As you know, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic and Slovakia refused to participate in the relocation scheme of the asylum seekers, which was conceived by the EU at the height of the crisis in 2015. So they rejected these mandatory refugee quotas, which were supposed to distribute asylum seekers in a solidary manner between the EU member states. So, indeed, rather I would like to quote David Runciman here, who in his 2018 book, The Confidence Trap, A History of Democracy in Crisis from World War I to the present, says that just because democracies have been guilty of crying wolf in the past doesn't mean there is no wolf out there. So indeed, there is a wolf out there, I guess. And this relates back to your talk yesterday, that discourse is discourse, but it has real effects it has political effects, it does political work and becomes palpable in life as well. But what I want to highlight is that the real world developments in Eastern Europe are widely read through an interpretive lens of an embedded sociocultural resource or a discursive structure, if you will, about what Eastern Europe supposedly stands for. So the historically liminal position of Eastern Europe in the political imaginaries of those who have traditionally enjoyed a sense of entitlement to speak and act in the name of Europe has, of course, provided a hospitable soil for the wide reading of the recent developments in Central and Eastern Europe through the prism of normative threats for the European project of democracy and unity and peace. And of course, what we should also pay attention to is that these Central and East European apologists of illiberal democracy do not really negate Europe as such, but they posit a very distinct vision of Europe, with an emphasis on, so to speak, organic national communities, Christian tradition, national or popular sovereignty, effectively equating populist and democratic in their accounts. So their scorn of multiculturalism and minority rights, and of course disdain of what they call Europe's culture of victimhood, such as, for instance, Maria Schmidt says that the EU is unable to, and I quote her, stand up for its own values, way of life and culture. So this criticism goes very much against the grain of the ideal type depiction of the European Union's normative order, with the rule of law, respect for civil liberties, human and minority rights, gender equality, multiculturalism, minority cultures, multi-level governance, relatively liberal forms of representative government. So instead of the EU-enshrined values of pluralism and non-discrimination and tolerance and justice and solidarity, no matter how skewed they might be in practice, the emphasis of these Central East European populists is brazenly on the securitization of their national selves, their national traditions and national values. So, indeed, this problem of East Europeanness that an Estonian writer and conservative columnist Mihkel Mutt has described, not particularly politely, as the PITA problem of Eastern Europe, the pain in the ass problem of Eastern Europe, appears in two main modalities. First, it appears as an already materialized harm, And of course, as also the looming promise of further damage in Hungary's and Poland's violation of democratic rules of the game. And secondly, it appears as a threat of the return of a particular normative order that the Europe hopes it has done peace with and moved away from. So this idea that there is this return of nationalism, xenophobia, very much endangers the present self of Europe. And this is seen as something that is exemplified by the very reluctance of certain East European countries to accept refugees and the alleged general xenophobia in these countries. So cumulatively, one could say that the normative threat of Eastern Europe purportedly jeopardizes liberal democracy as a constitutive norm and solidarity as an underlying value of the European community. So why this is such a big of a problem, of course, is that it's not just the concern about Poland and Hungary going south, if one were to paraphrase Jan Werner Müller. But the disturbing trend of detaching democracy from the commitment to liberal values is regarded as potentially fateful for the viability of the liberal democratic model of governance and, by consequence, for the EU as a whole. So there is this typical fear of a slippery slope. And this is evident throughout the manifold academic, policy, and media debates. So we get such suggestions that there is a clear threat to democracy at the heart of the European Union in Poland's and Hungary's defiance of the rule of law and legally binding decisions of the EU, and this presents a risk of contagion for the EU, along with the threat that the European Union would thus lose its cohesion, its external clout. And of course, you know, the loss of the academic freedom, all that is happening around the Central European University in Hungary these days is seen as a fundamental threat to European principles, and as some particularly media discourses would put it, to freedom everywhere. Orban's populist experiment is depicted as challenging the moral core of the European project. So therefore, the grim warning that the Western liberal order's apparent collapse in 2016 could turn out to be yet another historic upheaval that began in Eastern Europe, as Jan Werner Müller writes. So what we can sift out from these discourses are basically two uncomfortable questions that underpin this thread of the debate. Both of them detecting the anxiety of being subverted by this illiberal other, and thus they go to the heart of the EU's vision of itself. So first, there is this question whether the European Union has actually fulfilled its democracy-building promise with acceding the post-communist states, or if not, then when exactly went wrong. And secondly, it's more sort of practical, contingent, managerial question. Is the European Union really equipped with proper legal and political instruments to intervene in case its members are undermining the Union's functioning principles in practice? And this is something that is being tried out with the Article 7, or the so-called nuclear option, vis-à-vis Hungary and Poland. So some, of course, as the scholars of the region and many of you, the scholars of democratization, also know that there is a thread in this debate that finds a quantum of solace in the assertion that in the East European case, actually, there was and there has never been much to hollow out in the first place, as Bela Kreskovits would suggest, because the post-socialist democracies have and have always had a hollow core, accordingly. So the idea basically is that, you know, whatever democratization they've experienced, the consolidation has always been somewhat illusory. But of course, views are divided, and views are further divided about the particularly East European versus a more universal nature of the current democratic malaise. For some, illiberal norms have long cohabited with the liberal ones in the political center ground across the East Central Europe, only recently overpowering the former. Whereas for the others, the upsurge of illiberalism in the region is less about the weak elite commitment to the values of liberal democracy and more about the genuine failure of liberalism to deliver. But again, of course, as many others have noticed, we do get a sense of this interesting, strongly moral language here, theologically flavored terms such as backsliding, reverting to old sins, and be that as it may, but the association of wider Eastern Europe with the onslaught and spread of illiberal democracy, of course, evokes profound anxieties at multiple levels. As I said, this illiberal challenge, particularly of Orban's rule in Hungary and that of law and justice parties in Poland, appears as a normative threat of transgression and subtle subversion for the liberal democratic normative order that is underpinning the contemporary European project. The transgression of well-articulated democratic norms and intersubjectively acknowledged standards of behavior in the EU by two of the weightiest Central East European member states of the Union has exposed an internal vulnerability and generated a sensation of harm in the whole of the European community. And what, of course, Hungary's and Poland's evident lack of respect for a set of central democratic principles underpinning this European project illuminates is the EU's attachment to democratic norms. In a way, its deep identitarian dependence on and caring about the acknowledgement and maintenance of the liberal democratic values and principles within the political boundaries of the EU. So this is just to illustrate this lack of solidarity on the East European side, and one of the evocative critics, Jan Kross, historian, another Princeton historian, not mincing words in his criticism about the Polish behavior in that context. But I guess what we need to remember is that historically, again, Eastern Europe has always been constituted as less Europe, rather than anti-Europe or non-Europe. So the region's relative incongruence with European standards, norms, and expectations of behavior and governance has also always been deemed, or at least in the post-Cold War era, been deemed a subject of socialization. So what we see now, this clear juxtaposition of some Central East European states of themselves against these constitutive norms and values of the EU in recent years, demonstrates the very subversive potential of the liminal actors that I started out with. It demonstrates how these actors now really openly embrace their difference, their ambiguity, their in-betweenness, in a way that is very much provoking the current structure, the normative order underpinning the EU community. Okay, so the question is whether or not the promise of 1989 or the window of 1989-1991 is actually broken now. And of course, this window is critical. It marked a critical juncture in the process of also East Europeans becoming European, becoming more fully European, accepted as at least institutionally fully European. But arguably the mindset about their lesser Europeanness persists in new iterations. And this is another quote by this already cited Estonian author, Mihkel Mutt, who I think rather evocatively captures the what we could describe as the enduring mentality in the dialogue, in this dialogue between a senior and a more junior European diplomat discussing the East European predicament in an imaginary Brussels cafe. So there is a mini lecture that takes place. An older colleague called Okak van der Velde lectures, and a younger colleague called Janos Securitate Igasse. And basically he muses you know, all this talk about Eastern Europe catching up, all these ideas about there being the European solidarity that amounts to anything more than an illusion is empty air, right? So to conclude, is the dream over or not? What the conflicting perspectives on sovereignty, national and popular sovereignty, and the distinct takes on tradition and the past between some Central East European states and the European Union do, of course, they flag the inconsistencies in the post-Cold War self-congratulatory narrative of the European Union as a successful promoter of democracy, as an efficient socializer of East European students into an inclusionary liberal norm set, and of course as a bold unifier of the continent thereof. So Central East European backlash, or some states' backlash to the perceived post-nationalist, cosmopolitan and federalist agendas of the European elites very much disturbs the foundational myth of the Union, which depicts European integration as the result of an aspiration to overcome nationalism in order to ensure the stability and security of the continent. So whereas the European Union's autobiographical myth is breaking with the past, this is understood by the likes of Mariëlle and Viktor Orban as one of embarrassed alienation and juxtaposed to the East Europeans' respect towards the past, in Hungary's case. So what such discourse and, of course, the related political developments in the region do, they point also at the deeper anxieties within the European Union. And some of these anxieties are systemic. They are, you know, as I said, about the basic efficacy of the Union in integrating the new members and the legitimacy of the Union, and some are more contingent. They are about the basic uncertainty about how we should defend the European political order from such challenges and of course from the populist and illiberal upsurge. But just to finish off, what does it mean for us as the academic community interested in the region? One can, of course, notice that there is also a palpable resentment for the academic community about the Eastern Europe in many ways failing as a laboratory of democratization and normative socialization into the European community of liberal democratic norms and values. So this return of the familiar script of Eastern Europe as a threat of transgression and subtle subversion of Europe's normative order, of course, also provides a routine way for both policy and academic communities to alleviate some of their own anxieties in the midst of these multiple contemporary crises. From the institutional perspective of the European Union, it is as if an embedded identitarian control mechanism has been reactivated in order to escape a paralyzing sense of ontological insecurity amidst the many upheavals the European Union faces from within and external world in this day and age. So, to wrap up, the reappearance of Eastern Europe as a challenge to the European liberal democratic normative order could accordingly be interpreted as a late recurrence of Europe's post-Cold War peace anxieties. It also, demonstrates an endeavor to reinstate the pre-existing objects of fear, systems of meaning, and standards of moral purpose. But yet, as in any discussion about, what makes us as us secure in particular ways, we should remember what scholars such as Christopher Browning and Finnish political scientist Pertti Joeniemi have reminded us about. Ontological security is not just about stability, but it is also about adaptability or openness towards and the ability to cope with change. So what this allocation of meaning to the trope of Eastern Europe and its mobilization demonstrates, it points at a perpetual struggle over power to define what Europe is and, of course, what it should be like. And I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we will now move on to our final speaker, who is Professor Stephen Hutchings. Professor Stephen Hutchings is now a professor of Russian studies at the University of Manchester. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and former president of the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies. His research interests lie in the fields of contemporary Russian media, film, and cultural studies, and he's been the recipient of numerous research grants, the most recent of which is connected to the project Reframing Russia for the Global Mediasphere from Cold War to Information War, which is also the topic of his talk today. Please.
I should also begin by thanking the Aleksanteri-instituutti for inviting me. I don't think I've ever been as well fed in my entire life. So now I have to sing for my supper. Normally one sings first and then gets one's supper, but it's the other way around with me, so that takes a bit of pressure off. You may note that the title of my talk has changed ever so slightly. I'm not going to tell you why. I'm going to provide a couple of visual clues so that you can work it out for yourselves. I'm sure it'll all become very transparent. The picture on the left is the original poster for one of the classic Cold War films, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. So you can figure out the title as I speak. Before I begin to speak, I wanted to provide just a little plug for our new project, which is 1 year into 3 years, and if you want to check it out, there's the URL for you there. Right, so our conference has been reflecting on really the extended trajectory of the 20th century's defining event, the Cold War. Because the tensions that this phenomenon generated both predate and persist beyond it. The Soviet Union's Cold War on democracy has seemingly been substituted by Putin's rather opportunistic information war, arguably a greater threat to Western democracy than the rather lumbering Soviet propaganda machine. Inevitably, parallels between Soviet and post-Soviet propaganda technologies and techniques continue to be drawn. I'm just going to draw your attention to the title of one quite influential recent report. I won't read the title to it, it's not the most elegant of titles, but at least it tells you what it's about. And there is a whole cottage industry of reports of this kind. And like others within that industry, it portrays digital technology as offering new tools capable of unprecedented disruption and deception. Russia's current war on democracy, the report, like the others in the series argues, is waged not only by centrally coordinated state actors, but also by sub-state social media users and online commentators. And the logic of this kind of model, this paradigm, this way of looking at things is reflected in a recent article whose details you'll find there. Again, I won't read you the full quote. First, false or misleading content is created by Russian-affiliated media outlets like RT. Second, you have false multipliers, trolls and bots that amplify that content. And third, mutually reinforcing digital entities which perpetuate the narrative. And what I want to do today is to suggest that this model provides a limited understanding of what is problematically called information war. I want to challenge the linearity of the narrative that such reports embrace. I want to question the assumptions they make that the media environments targeted by Russia's propaganda operation are somehow fixed and passive. And I want to oppose the notion of a coordinated disinformation campaign integrating broadcasters, trolls, and bots, together with the underlying assumption that the organizations which implement those strategies are somehow homogeneous and completely lacking in their own agency. The digital revolution has produced a hyper-networked mediasphere in which propagators of state media campaigns struggle to adjust to active audiences, to the greater access those audiences have to alternative narratives, and to accelerating multi-directional information flows. And those challenges, I think, necessitate a series of reframings, and it's those reframings that provide the inspiration for our project. First of all, there's the reframing by researchers like myself of conventional linear propaganda models. Then there's the Kremlin's own difficulties in reframing the propaganda operations that it deploys in domestic contexts for international audiences. And then thirdly, there's the enhanced tendency for participatory audiences to reframe those narratives yet again. I want to highlight just one consequences that connects all three reframings: the imbrications, the overlaps of the competing narratives, logics, and identities facilitated by a hyper-networked media sphere. I'm going to draw on media event theory, about which a little more shortly. And I want to target just one episode in a single media event phenomenon, the notorious interview conducted by international broadcaster RT with the two suspects identified by British security services in connection with the poisoning in Salisbury of double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. So now the subtitle should be all only too clear to you. Now, this one incident probably seems far too ephemeral to support my broader argument. However, the transnational narratives, identities, and networks which characterize the mediatized space in which interstate information battles occur, I believe can't be captured solely by processing vast amounts of quantitative data. Rather, I think we should seek the sort of points of convergence, the nodal points, to adapt a concept from Ernesto Laclau, at which these phenomena intersect. And RT's bizarre interview, I would suggest, represents just one such point. So, media event theory, which I won't dwell on in detail, originates in Diane and Katz's seminal work of that name, Media Events, depicting how state and media collaborate in the production of shared national rituals. Diane and Katz's theory has been adapted to include non-ceremonial disruptive events like terrorist attacks. It's also been heavily critiqued for portraying them as unifying occasions rather than as the site at which discursive tensions play out. And this more agonistic view of media events gains traction, of course, from the multi-platform opportunities that digitization grants to non-state actors to redefine events, and also from the global circulation of information that it brings. Nonetheless, the idea of state-media collaboration collusion is retained, even in Nick Couldry and Andreas Hepp's recent recasting of media events in this new dispensation that I'm describing as, and again the quote is there, certain situated, thickened, centering performances, so the idea of centering is still there, of mediated communication that reach a wide and diverse multiplicity of audiences and participants. And Couldry and Hepp and others clarify that audience appropriations of these centering performances mean that the construction of a mediated center contains, or rather remains, a contested process. And I think it's into this dynamic that the Salisbury media event can be inserted. What's more, media events occurring within interstate conflict produce actually, or involve several mediated centers pulling in different directions, generating multiple narratives, each of which is contested both from within domestic media spaces and beyond the respective state boundaries. And this makes it, I think, even more imperative to identify those points of convergence, those nodal points at which the narratives and the thickened meanings that they generate come together. So, very briefly, what we've been doing, I and the rest of my research team, is looking at the co-construction of the Salisbury event by multiple actors. We've done a comparative, or still are doing, a comparative discourse analysis involving cross-platform coverage. We looked at BBC One, BBC World, Russian Channel 1 and RT. Contextualized through selective data analysis, so I'm not completely averse to counting. I read, but I also count as well, when it suits me. Particularly when it comes to audience responses, as you'll see. For each of 8 points we identified, so we didn't, obviously it's an ongoing event, it's still unfolding, as you know. We identified 8 points, and for each of those 8 points, we looked at news broadcasts on the day and 2 days before and after. We also, so there they are, again, I won't read through all of them. We also examined each channel's website coverage of the developments, relevant developments. But there, we restricted our analysis to just 5 of the 8 periods, culminating in the RT interview, and those are the ones coloured in red. And what our discourse analysis has done or has highlighted are the conflicting narratives at play. So by focusing on key terms, media genres, and a series of representational techniques and procedures, we identified the range of actors involved in articulating the narratives. We tried to get at the institutional cultures in which they were embedded and the way these narratives interplay and respond to one another. We also trying to describe the particular media logics, those of securitization, neoliberalism, and what we've called journalistic professionalism or professionalization, which shape how these narratives are deployed. And this apparatus, taken as a whole, is designed to demonstrate how the location of nodal points like the RT interview can really capture the flows and the intersections which define contemporary media events as Couldry and Hepp have described them. Now, so to move to the analysis itself, and you'll forgive me if I concentrate on the findings rather than take you through each methodological step. I think the first thing to say is that the very facts of the Salisbury story foreground the roles of the respective security apparatuses in carrying out and covering up the poisoning, identifying the suspects, and addressing threats posed to public safety and confidence. Indeed, security really became the driver of the narratives, since the restrictions imposed by both security apparatuses on the flow of information into the public domain created multiple gaps in each state's account. And this fed the speculation on which the story thrived and continues to thrive. So who exactly was Sergei Skripal? Has he ceased collaborating with MI6? How was he targeted and why? Where is he now? How exactly was Novichok smuggled into the UK? Who in the chain of command gave the order to kill him? How were the suspects identified? Who are they really, and where are they now? So if you're looking at me to provide answers to all those questions, you're looking at the wrong person. I'm not sure that any of those questions have been sort of answered satisfactorily. But it's the securitized context that all of these gaps have created that have made it the BBC's duty as the establishment broadcaster to align with the state and maintaining public calm. And as a result, alternative theories that sort of circulating in the online world tended to be marginalized, including some fairly plausible ones. For example, the idea that the poisoning was carried out by a Russian state actor, but without Putin's explicit approval. And that, interestingly, is a narrative that Russian state media also excluded. So there's a sort of collusion across, as well as within adversarial environments. And as a result, with the BBC, we've got a series of quite interesting encounters and a number of very, very prominent BBC presenters completely nonplussed. So there was an interview that Kirsty Walk, who fronts perhaps the best news magazine programme on the BBC Newsnight, when she interviewed Mikhail Khodorkovsky, when he gave an account of Putin as a weak leader who's in hock to criminal groups, she just didn't know how to respond. It didn't compute, either with Khodorkovsky's status as a brutally repressed dissident or with the dominant narrative about Putin's culpability for the poisoning. And then there was Andrew Marr, who's perhaps the leading political interviewer in the UK, and he suffered a similar mental block when he was trying to understand an absolutely crystal clear explanation that Russian state responsibility doesn't necessarily entail direct culpability. It just didn't compute. And this is a smart guy, but so ingrained has this kind of dominant narrative become that it excludes the possibility of even quite plausible alternatives. The securitization closely aligns with mediatization, and that can be best illustrated by the series of grainy CCTV images of the two suspects, and these have now almost become sort of global icons of the event. I'm just going to go back a slide for a moment. So the growing imperative to forestall threats coincides with the need to shape the flow of information into the public sphere. And so Salisbury initiated sustained state media collaboration that did indeed seem to hark back to Diane and Katz. So from the choreographed British police statements, through the BBC News's dramatised opening segments featuring Theresa May's announcement of sanctions, and then to poor Victoria Skripal's tour of Russian television talk show studios. The poor woman was dragged out day after day after day she's the cousin of Yulia Skripal, to counter the each sort of new step or each new twist in the British media narrative. And then Yulia Skripal gave this meticulously planned video rebuttal of claims on the Russian media that she was somehow a prisoner of MI6. And then the famous interview, to which I'll come. So part of this collusion, as I'm suggesting, involves sort of mutual media rebuttals. We're not quite at that point yet. At the height of the crisis, Channel 1's political talk show Vremya Pokazhet, which you talked about yesterday, didn't you? And as you said, it's very frequent. And during the Salisbury crisis, it was putting out new editions every day, each ridiculing the latest Western media allegation. But the BBC, too, closely scrutinized Russian media coverage. At the end of her report on Putin's claims to have found the suspects, remember, it was Putin who first said, "We found them." The BBC Moscow correspondent, at the end of her report, it ended, "All eyes are on state Russian TV to see how Russia will respond." And this inter-broadcaster dynamic meant that the Salisbury as a global media story was effectively co-created by opposing state-aligned outlets. And this, I think, this paradox belies the apparent status of Salisbury as a classic media event. And so, too, do the appropriations of digital platforms. It's true, these new affordances are undoubtedly very powerful tools. And Russia made strategic use of Twitter, for example, to mock its adversaries. So one example was the creation of a viral, highly likely hashtag. This emanates from Sergei Lavrov, in fact. It was he who started this hashtag to ridicule British Prime Minister's declaration that Russian state culpability was highly likely. And so you've got the tweet from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, sincere thanks to Mrs. May, and then they have a shot of British weather. Who's responsible? It's highly likely that the Russians are to blame. So you get the idea. But they used and overused it ad nauseum. And then there's the rather tasteless before and after images of Julia Skripal. So the idea that you take Novichok and look what it does to your appearance. What is it? Just believe the magic of Novichok. Now, of course, these strategies were nonetheless deployed alongside a very different strategy, the one taken on the likes of Vremya Pokazhet, which took a very forensic approach, frame by frame, analyzing each kind of, for example, the Julia Skripal interview, the statement, it did a frame-by-frame analysis, showing that the whole thing was a fake and a construct. Then you have the Russian language Twitter sphere, which I've talked about, and yes, despite what I said at the beginning, there is an argument for saying that Russia managed to intervene in British online media space. So we did look at the responses to BBC web reports, and sure enough, 9 of the top 10 comments of several of them, particularly the one relating to the expulsion of 23 Russian diplomats, were hostile to the UK. That's the BBC website. So who knows, but it is at least plausible that there may have been some Russian influence there. But more important point is I think we need to distinguish between direct instrumentalizations of new media tools of the sort I've just been describing and the indirect structural tensions they generate. Those same information gaps that I've talked about and which reinforce the securitization, mediatization access also act as stimuli for multiple non-state and sub-state actors that inhabit a very complex global media ecology. And they include, amongst others, independent news outlets whose relative freedom sometimes reflects the opportunities offered by digital media environment. So in Russia, as we have the likes of Kommersant and Mediazona and Dozhd and Novaya Gazeta, etc., all of whom made quite important interventions in the coverage of the event. International broadcasters that operate in different legislative and commercial contexts from their domestic equivalents and therefore are obliged to behave differently. RT, particularly when it was under pressure from Ofcom, did change its approach quite dramatically and became a very, very different outlet from what you were seeing on domestic Russian television. Equally, if you've ever cared to watch BBC World News, you'll find it's a very, very different beast altogether from domestic Russian television. Much more tabloid, much more careless and free and easy, and much more likely to stray beyond this very sort of controlled set of narratives. And because the BBC world is operating in a very, very different environment. And then there's the citizen activists, so the little-known investigative outfit Bellingcat claimed that it identified the 2 Skripal suspects as GRU officers, aided by a Russian online publication called The Insider. I might say a bit more about that shortly. Then you have social media trolls that I've talked about, and we shouldn't forget the pranksters. Poor, long-suffering former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson was the victim of a hoax phone call from the Armenian Prime Minister during the Salisbury crisis. Boris Johnson is Britain's answer to Donald Trump. I'm not sure who that does more of a disservice to, but my hope is that Boris Johnson will eventually be exposed as an FSB agent. He certainly behaves like one. But these actors, they inhabit an environment in which national allegiances are thoroughly intertwined. So Kommersant, which I mentioned, has a UK branch. Russian trolls are indeed hard to differentiate from domestic observers who share hostility to the BBC, of which there are a lot. The Insider collaborates with Bellingcat, which is fronted by an English gentleman. RT employs English-speaking staff acculturated to the context in which they work. And they are sometimes liable to go rogue. Remember the spate of post-Crimea live on-air protests and resignations. And that, of course, brings us neatly to RT's interview. Many were puzzled that it came via RT. The Kremlin's initial concern seemed to be with keeping home audiences on side, with its hedged account attributing blame either to British intelligence or to non-Russian state actors. And initially, English-speaking audiences did indeed endorse RT's scepticism about British official accounts. So we looked at its Skripal playlist consisting of 60 videos with a combined viewer numbers of 1.6 million, which is quite a lot. These videos were upvoted 32,000 times, compared with only 4,200 downvotes, so they seem to be doing their job. On one video, 73% of comments referred to a British state conspiracy, 27% noted inconsistencies in British claims, and then in response to another one, 35% suggested conspiracy, 95% were critical of Britain. So this is RT doing its job quite effectively. Then, on September the 5th, 2018, the BBC reported the identification of Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bashirov via CCTV images, the timing of whose release reconfirms British security's central involvement in the media management of the conflict. And a week later, as I said, Putin announced that Petrov and Bashirov had been found. They were just ordinary civilians and might be a good idea if they contact the media. Following day, as if by magic, RT released a YouTube interview, available simultaneously in Russian and with English subtitles, conducted by none other than Margarita Simonyan, RT's editor-in-chief and Putin's close confidant. In the interview, Simonyan asked the men who they were. They were tourists visiting Salisbury's Cathedral with its 123-metre spire, a detail that corresponded suspiciously to Salisbury's Wikipedia entry. She inquired about their jobs. They claimed to be fitness entrepreneurs. Perhaps we can... Oh, right, okay. And then she asked them if they'd carried Novichok in a perfume bottle, to which they indignantly asked why would men be carrying women's perfume. And this connected to an odd sexual subtext. When asked about their friendship, they refused to discuss details, provoking speculation that they might be gay, and so on and so forth. These were no brave spies who came in from the cold. They were spies who slunk back from the snow, because she asked them, why did you go twice to Salisbury? Oh, well, the first time there was a bit of snow, and we had to come back. These were big, sort of beefy Russian young men. And responses to the interview were an unmitigated disaster. 74% of English language comments were critical. Some noted the interview had changed their opinion of the whole affair. Not a very convincing interview at all, said one. I wasn't doubting the Russian government until I saw this interview. Then another, well, I'll come to the other one shortly. So again, the percentages show that only 16% were critical of Britain. And when you get to the Russian version, interestingly, the comments were equally critical. So you have one declaring, one comment, until today I perceived this Skripal story as Britain's provocation. But once I saw these two idiots, my view was shaken. So the idea of RT as an agile instrument of the Russian state begins to fall apart. As another comment put it, by posting this video and also not disabling comments, you've totally screwed yourselves. And I work out the Russian for yourselves. And even Simonyan's efforts to signal some ironic distance were misread as an act of state trolling. So it's a mystery why RT was chosen as the vehicle for the Russian denial, why Simonyan, not a practiced interviewer, at least not recently, should have led the interview or conducted the interview? Was it an effort to add authenticity in the pitch to domestic audiences for whom an interview with a familiar propagandist like Kisselyov might have raised suspicions? Who knows? What is clear is that the difficulties that states now encounter in separating domestic and international audiences, and that's just one of the structural effects of the global media ecology. I was going to talk also about another, I will talk briefly about another ridiculed aspect of Simonyan's interview, her performance of journalistic professionalism. She tried to sort of perform this objective skepticism towards the suspects, and it didn't work. However, rather than dismissing this as the act of a cynical propagandist, I think we'd be much better served, looking seriously about not to see the likes of RT as just a collection of cynical propagandists. These people do see themselves as part of a global community of media professionals. And indeed, RT, yes, it's been condemned many times for fake news and so on, but it has also won a series of quite prestigious international awards. And to ignore that aspect of these actors, not to recognize that they do have their own agency, I think is to arrive at a completely distorted and reductive understanding of how Russian propaganda, if you can call it that, works. I should also say that the BBC itself is sort of a victim of some of these media logics at work. Journalistic professionalism is one. The sort of neoliberal sensationalism, the desire to increase clickbait and clicks, and scoops and so on is another. RIA Novosti tried to kind of channel that particular logic when it claimed that the many outlets wanted to secure the interview, and certain radio stations, meaning Echo Moskvy, worked up a crazed activism. But then there's the BBC Moscow correspondent who claimed a coup when she supposedly confirmed the identity of the two suspects by going all the way to the Far East and interviewing members of the community, when, according to her own tweet, Kommersant had got there before her. So this is that sort of same media logic at work in British media space as well. And I think then I can, seeing as I'm out of time, I can miss that I was going to talk a little bit about coping strategies. So one of the exchanges was she asked, I think it was Petrov, are you a GRU agent? And he responds rather than "Ah oui?" And that turned into a kind of meme that played out as a post-Soviet form of styob, which I argue is part of the a coping strategy that Russian media actors have developed. So there are my conclusions, which I won't read through all of them. I think the central point is that the information war paradigm is not empirically wrong, but it does occlude and cover up and ignore the complexity of the conditions in which the practices it describes occur. And that if you look at these nodal points, as I call them, you can really get at some of this interplay of forces that will give you a much more accurate and a much better picture of the struggle that state-line broadcasters, including the BBC, have thriving and surviving in this environment. So yes, we need to develop robust responses to the activities of disruptive state actors, but in order to do that, we have to arrive at a deeper understanding of the processes that structure them. So that's my kind of central point. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll now have around 20 minutes or so for questions. Please wait for the microphone to arrive to you so that the entire audience can hear you as well as on the live stream. And also please introduce yourself before posing a question. So who can I give the word first?
Thank you. Thank you to both of our speakers for excellent talks. I just wanted to address some of the last points that you made, Stephen. I'm Jeremy Morris from the University of Aarhus. So Simon Jan and RT, it's interesting that example of her doing this interview, because you talked about agency, but perhaps it's another way of looking at it is her kind of entrepreneurialism as a media actor, which is ironic that it would emerge in this media space that we think of as being so controlled, in contrast to the UK media space, which we think of as characterized by neutrality and editorial integrity, right? So maybe you could comment a little bit more about that. Her as an entrepreneur in a non-free media space.
Shall I answer that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and actually a good point. Yes, one can't imagine her equivalent in the UK sort of acting in a similar fashion. And well, first of all, she is a very, very ambitious woman. She has a career, and she's risen through the ranks very, very swiftly, and she clearly has enormous ambition. And I think she, decided to intervene in that situation and to try to take control and really took on bit off more than she could chew. But it's not the only example of what paradoxically appears as greater freedom. It is true, and RT boasts that it offers its sort of star presenters editorial freedom to a much greater extent than is the case with, let's say, BBC presenters who operate, as you say, in this very strictly kind of managed environment. And yes, it can be very effective, particularly if you've chosen sort of appropriate presenters who are going to present a very strong kind of anti-hegemonic or counter-hegemonic anti-Western view. But then you get the likes of Abby Martin, who is an ambitious presenter herself, and who went rogue after the 2014 Crimea crisis and used her editorial independence to protest against the annexation of Crimea, because she heralds from the Occupy movement in America. So she has her own kind of set of values that largely align with what RT is trying to do, but on occasion they don't. And because these actors are given rather more freedom than you might expect, it can lead to mishaps. So that was one mishap, and then the Simanyan interview was a different kind of mishap, but attributable to the same phenomenon. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I saw a question in the back, gentleman.
Thank you. Could you probably compare, or I don't know how familiar is the subject, but compare this current media policy or propaganda that you were describing with this maybe early 30s and the Soviet period, well, when the Soviet Union certainly had a much more coherent and ambitious probably ideology, and there were certainly also outlets and networks of influence and ability and intention to influence the Western debates, well, sort of PR for Soviet Union and ideology wider. So to which extent do you think this comparison can be productive, or I mean, how different is this language and this ways of communicating are today from this period? Well, understanding it's certainly not the same thing, but yeah, to which extent?
I think it is important to make those comparisons, but I think that that particular comparison is important to make because of the contrast and the difference that you get. So, well, you yourself, I think, touched on the relevant points in your phrasing of the question. So, yes, there was a coherent ideology to be propagated, and now there is no coherent ideology, and the way that actors like RT behave is much more opportunistic. So it's a pick and choose that allows you to align yourself with particular forces in particular contexts for particular reasons. The downside, of course, of that is that it doesn't add up to anything particularly coherent, other than this vague notion that RT and Russian kind of media operation is the flag bearer for all those who believe in the end of the unipolar world and who want to see a multipolar world and who are against the hegemony of the United States. So that's a very, very catch-all, vague kind of set of values. So that is very different from Marxism-Leninism, which was a very sort of much more coherent and detailed and thought through set of ideas and a philosophy, a genuine philosophy, whatever you think of it. It was much more strictly controlled and coordinated from the centre. I've spoken to people who work for Radio Moscow, and they had much less freedom within which to operate than the kind of. It's a kind of contracting out. So what Russia does, like other neoliberal states, it contracts out its operations, and that comes with advantages and it comes with disadvantages. That is not what the Soviet state did. Radio Moscow, but Radio Moscow was the first international broadcaster. It preceded Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and so on. So Russia was ahead of the game in attempting to propagate its ideologies to an international audience, but it did so in a really quite different way from the way that international broadcasters for neo-authoritarian states, not just Russia, act at present. But yes, I think it's still valuable to make the comparisons. And I'm not denying that, there are certain continuities, of course there are. But I think the differences tend to outweigh the continuities.
Okay, I've already collected a few questions. We'll first go to Ekaterina Kalinina.
Thank you, Professor Hutchings, for interesting analysis of RT. I have a question regarding the conceptual framework that you use, and that one is of information warfare. And I wonder whether in your research you've been looking at so-called Gerasimov's doctrine, where he actually relies upon Russian military thought, and especially Slepchenko and his idea of new generation warfare, where he actually points out that we are not yet at information warfare state, because that's the next step. And what we are witnessing now, it's a series of information operations. And the use of the use of a notion of media events kind of makes me think that it's about information operations rather than information warfare. Do you know what I mean?
In short, I think you're right. I misled you if I tried to suggest that information warfare was part of our conceptual framework. It's the opposite. It's part of our object of analysis. We find the term very problematic for all kinds of reasons, some of which you've given. I mean, the point I didn't mention is that the information warfare here, there's always only one actor, and it's Russia. So it's always Russia's information war. Seems to me that if you're going to use information war, then by definition there have to be more than one party. But that's perhaps not the most important point. You mentioned Gerasimov, and of course, when in these reports that I've mentioned at the beginning, you often have mention of the Gerasimov doctrine, and this is the foundation of the idea of an integrated campaign in which you have broadcasters and trolls and bots and so on, and other actors all acting in this coordinated hybrid warfare. I don't know whether any of you follow the work of Mark Galliotti, who's actually a very astute and very good commentator on all things Russian. And he recently issued an apologia, because he rightly said, I'm the person who created the term Gerasimov doctrine. And in fact, there is no Gerasimov doctrine. There never was, and there certainly isn't. Because it's created such confusion and it's misled not only researchers, but more importantly, politicians to such an extent, I feel it necessary to state that, you know, I shouldn't have used the term. It doesn't exist. So yes, we're using concepts like media events because I think they're much much better suited to getting at the complexities of what is actually happening. Information war is although we have it in our project title, I would remind you that it comes in inverted commas. So it's information war. More as an object to be deconstructed rather than as part of our own conceptual framework.
Okay, I propose that we take 3 more questions, but take them together. So we start here with Dimo. Please be brief. Yes.
Hello, my name is Dmitry Yagodin, postdoc here at Aleksanteri-instituutti. My question to both of you is about the role of media and the role of digital revolution in changing what is media now. And I wanted to hear your opinion on the processes that you witnessed in the Eastern Europe or in the information warfare about the distinction on media being as an institution and media being as a tool. And what is your opinion about the digital revolution changing this balance of tool and institute? Thank you.
Then we have a question in the back.
Hello, my name is Aleksanteri. I'm from the University of Bucharest Faculty of History, and I have some questions for the first presenter. Isn't the normative threat a consequence of the Europe with 2 speeds? So isn't the normative threat becoming a reality, or it's underlined by the existence of 2 speeds between Eastern versus West? This is my first question. And the second one is how quotas of immigrants can adapt to the democratic values of the European Union, which involve the freedom of an individual, no matter if he is citizen or non-citizens. And also I have a comment besides that, the word quotas in the former communist countries has an overwhelming negative value because of the planification of the quinquennals and so on. And for the second speaker, I have a question which is much more methodological. Can this model of analysis be applied to the Khashoggi case in analyzing the events that happened in the embassy in Saudi Arabia, in the Turkish embassy, the Saudi Arabia and Turkey? Can this be applied as a model or a pattern of analyzing the news, seeing who is getting them, how they are promoting, and so on? These are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, final one, the gentleman here on my left. Again, please, brief question.
Thank you. I'm Ilkka Liikanen, University of Eastern Finland. I have a question to Mälksoo. Your talk was most interesting to me, as I've been collecting material, analyzing material on the return of the West, the concept of West in public discussion and EU policies, for instance, Finnish foreign policy leadership statements and so on. And this is a parallel, maybe even preceding phenomenon to this return of Eastern Europe. In certain times, maybe inviting the other, the East, in front. So my question is, how do you see the relationship between these 2 phenomena, the return of the West and the return of Eastern Europe? Are there possible interconnections in this?
Okay, thank you. Mariëlle.
Okay.
Afraid you have time only for brief responses.
Thanks very much for your questions. I would need to look more into this, but I think certainly they are likely to be sort of very entangled parallel developments in that sense. I think the fact that you would have this re-emergence of Eastern Europe in various disguises as a normative threat, in a way you could read it as a case of this internally flustered we concept. You know, you return in the context of the crisis, in the context of this renewed anxieties, you return to old patterns, the old routines. This is one of the key kernels of ontological security theory also, that in a way you reach back to these old tropes or old routines. So in a way, you know, there could be something there in why these framings that seem to be going out of fashion are becoming again normal or acceptable. In terms of the media question, I mean, as you probably sensed, I come from the field of international studies, which means that my brush tends to be broad and less fine-tuned than area studies people. So I don't really delve into the sort of nuances of, you know, which media outlet could be acting as a particular tool in certain circumstances rather than as an independent institution. So I don't do that fine-grained an analysis, and this particular study does not really look into the social media dimension at all. But I do admit that, of course, you know, it's not anymore just an amplifier. It's something that has a very independent agency and you know, could definitely make this discussion even more fine-grained and interesting. With your question, I'm afraid I actually, due to my ear being slightly switched off, I'm not sure I actually got it right, and maybe we'll
later on, please.
Catch up later, okay?
So there, you know, it's this rhetorical of in Europe with two speeds, West versus East. So therefore, the consequence of competition between East versus West creates this normative threat. Is it accurate? Is this normative threat a consequence of the Europe with two speeds? This was, in fact, the question.
Okay, now I get it. No, I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so. I'd say they are different things. But what is rather happening here, I think, if you want to build or dig out any sort of causal inference within this discursive struggle that I tried to describe, one could say that what you see in case of how the Central and East European populists or illiberal Democrats themselves scorn certain values of Europe, a certain idea of the EU, is a reaction to the practices they feel they have been receiving from the liberal EU for a long time. And they are also often and have been stigmatizing practices, such as, you know, non-recognition or infantilization or you know, outright exclusion. So in that sense, there is this in a way, warning in this all, that you see how the referent objects of certain stigmatizing practices start manipulate with this earlier discourses and in a way create this mutual cycle of fear-mongering and securitization. But the two-speed thing is not really that prevalent in this context, in my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, Stephen, a few words, unfortunately, very short.
I'll try to be the question about media as tool or institution, which is a very good question. The answer is the latter. It can only now be studied institutionally because of the phenomenon of what's been called mediatization, that the media have penetrated politics, war, everyday life. You know, we're all sort of looking at our smartphones, probably you more than I at this point, to such an extent that it's now becomes very difficult to separate out the media as a tool for doing something when what is being done is itself a product of media. So the only way to study it is as a process and an institution. So that was the one. The one about could it be used to look at situations like the fate of the journalists in the Turkish embassy? Simple answer, yes, I think it could. I've not looked at that, but media events are useful because they're helpful pragmatically. They give you a way of narrowing down narrowing down and reducing the amount of material that you have to study. We're looking at 7 media events in our project, and we're trying to construct a typology of media events on the basis of our work. We're not quite there yet. Where the event in the Turkish embassy would fit into that typology, I don't know. But I think the answer is yes.
Okay, so please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers today. So we will now continue with the closing ceremony, and I would like to invite Suvi Kansikas to deliver some closing remarks.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you for the introduction. Dear colleagues, on behalf of the organizing committee of the 18th Aleksanteri Conference, I have the pleasure to make some concluding remarks about our conference. With 3 days and over 60 panels and roundtables, 3 plenary sessions here in the small hall, an impressive cultural program including film screenings, photo exhibitions, music and literature, I of course cannot summarize the conference here in the few minutes that I have for the concluding remarks. Therefore, I'd like to take the opportunity here to discuss 2 issues related to the conference theme. The periodization of the century from 1918 to 2018 and the concept of democracy. First thing that comes to my mind is that the latter theme, democracy in its different forms and during different time periods, has been the topic of numerous panels and discussions here at the conference. On the other hand, discussions on the periodization we use in our research, and also significantly, how we approach and understand and contextualize the phenomena we study, haven't figured as prominently during the conference discussion. The past century has seen major upheavals, wars, state and system building, and political, social, economic, and cultural development. Significantly, the era has also produced concepts with which we try to conceptualize these processes, namely periodizations with which we understand change in time. To name a few notable periods that we use, following the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote in the early 90s his famous book labeled the era from the start of the First World War in 1914 to the collapse of the Soviet Union as the short 20th century. And importantly, the title read The Age of Extremes. What needs to be borne in mind is that he did not predict the end of extremes or violence, nor the end of history for that matter. Quite the contrary. To quote Hobsbawm, the world of the third millennium will therefore almost certainly continue to be one of violent politics and violent political changes. The only thing uncertain about them is where they will lead." End of quote. However, the events of 1989 to 1991 and the rupture and the transformation that began after that, we use and label it the period we live in as post-socialist or post-Soviet, or depending on our discipline, also post-Cold War era. However, what I would like to do is to call on us to think that while upheavals such as the socialist system collapse give us important milestones and allow us to distinguish periods in the flow of time, upheavals, even in their most extreme, do not constitute an absolute break with the past. And here we should see the usefulness of the concept, legacies of the past. The study of how past experience influence future trajectories. And thinking about the topic of the conference and the region we study, we should in our analysis conceptualize the present as layers of different segments of our past. It is a post-socialist era that started almost 30 years ago, and it is also post-imperial era that started a century ago. And here I come to the second point of the concluding remarks, that of the study of democracy. Next autumn, we will commemorate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. At the time of the rapid systemic transformations and revolutions, I would argue, no one would have expected that some of the countries of Central Eastern Europe would be able to join the European Union in just 15 years after 1989. A major theme in our conference has been to study and talk about the democratization of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. However, it has to be borne in mind that we have also discussed during the conference that the term democracy has also figured prominently in these countries also in the past. We've heard presentations dealing with concepts of democracy with labels such as socialist democracy. And we speak of the Central Eastern European countries having been people's democracies. And currently, we also see labels such as sovereign democracy or illiberal democracy. They are competing visions to the Western liberal democracy. And I would like to conclude by suggesting that we start thinking about alternative concepts for the era that we are currently living in. The term post-socialist or post-Cold War do not really allow us to see what continuities we live in that have started a century ago in the region that we study. To suggest competing visions of democracy is one label that should also show us that the turn of 1990s is not such an upheaval. And next, I would like to, besides thank our sponsors for making this conference possible, I would also especially like to thank the people behind making this conference. Our conference organizing committee included Dragana Svetanovic, Vladimir Gelman, Emma Hakala, Niina Into, Jouni Järvinen, Sigrid Kaasiks-Krogerus, Markku Kangaspuro, Katalin Mikloshi, Minna Orosa, Mariëlle Wijermars, and most crucially, two excellent colleagues who you all got to know through extensive support and advice during the months and weeks preparing for the conference, namely Eva Korteniemi and Maria Lavonen. Besides this scientific board, there we have had extensive support for the technicalities in presenting and being able to go on with our work during the conference. And these are volunteers that are students from the University of Helsinki. And they included Amina Amethanova, Elena Garbachova, Rebekka Forsberg, Niika Hankkila, Jens Hattuniemi, Ella Hyvönen, Alina Jokela, Tiia Järviluoma, Valtteri Kinnula, Minna Likander, Taleja Menzel, Emil Mitikka, Anna Pakki, Riku Rantanen, Bradley Reynolds, Janne Suutarinen, Svetlana Talja, Georgi Ufimtsev, Inessa Zanina. I would finally like to ask you to give you our big thanks to everyone who contributed to organizing the conference. And now it's time to thank all of you. Thanks for coming to Helsinki, for participating and making this conference such a success. I hope you've enjoyed the conference, and I hope to see you soon again. As we leave now the 18th annual Aleksanteri Conference to become history, it's time to look ahead. Now we will hear the presentation of the theme of the next year's conference from Dr. Daria Gritsenko.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to ask you one question. What do nuclear weapons, pollution, machine automation, social medicine, industrial renaissance, railroad development, and national statistics have in common? They are technologies, right. While technology is sometimes conceptualized as a domain with a logic of its own, as a value-free manifestation of human progress, as an inevitable trend towards the development of the most efficient artifacts, most scholars by now converge to the understanding of technology as a social product, meaning that its development and use are conditioned by many factors, political and cultural, not only economic and scientific. Technologies and technological practice unfold in space. Sometimes they are territorial, and sometimes they are deterritorialized, and always working at the intersection of space, society, and culture. A growing body of scholarship has begun the examination of the spatial dimension of socio-technological systems. We want to enter this conversation through the lens of Russian, East European, Central Asian, and broader speaking, Eurasian experiences. This is why the topic of the next Aleksanteri Conference is Technology, Culture and Society in the Eurasian Space. In 2019, we want to invite scholars from all over the world to discuss how technologies are constructed, conditioned, adopted, maintained, abolished and repaired across the Eurasian space. This is an invitation to think about a variety of questions that relate to space and technology in a comparative perspective, and to bring forward theoretical insights from various disciplines in social sciences and in the humanities. The conference will encompass 4 large streams that investigate the intersection of technology with the studies of society, politics, culture, and explicitly address methodological and epistemological dimensions of studying socio-technological systems. Technology is a social phenomenon that extends from our apartments and goes to the international air traffic. It starts at the local bakery and goes into the global internet. Hence, it is necessary to shed light on the mechanisms at work at all the levels and across time. We ask which technologies historically provoked major disruptions in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. How did the societies respond to them? We find the ongoing space-shrinking technologies, from transport to ICT, fascinating in their capacity to both alter and preserve power relations. We want to know more about how will the emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence, distributed ledger, or the Internet of Things, change politics, social interactions, egalitarian processes, and forms of cultural productions in the future. We acknowledge that technology plays into the co-constructions of meanings about gender, race, and class. But can technology on its own change gender and class-based relations of power and inequality? Are the goods of new technology being distributed equitably today, or have they ever been distributed equitably in the past? And under which conditions can the new ways of being, which modern information and communications technology afford, be a source of increased freedom, self-determination, and democracy? We also want to ask, what does the bodily and physical experience mean in the virtual environments? Theoretically profound understanding of the more than human world is needed to develop an understanding of bodies, machines, and knowledges in the increasingly virtual and digital reality. Additionally, digital technologies has resulted in the emergence of a wealth of new and big data sources, such as digital archives, social media, and various kinds of digital media outlets, and they allow us to investigate Eurasian societies in novel ways with the help of digital tools. Meanwhile, digital platforms functioning as public arenas highlight questions of power and democracy, deep mediatization, and the digital divide. The 2019 occasion of the Aleksanteri Conference will bring together leading experts in digital humanities and Russian, East European, and Central Asia studies to examine how society, politics, economy, and culture across Eurasia are reconfigured in the context of past and future technological changes. What is new about the next year's conference is a dedicated digital humanities stream aimed at addressing methodological questions that are particular to the study of the digital transformation in Eurasia, as well as linguistic, legal, and ethical controversies involved in working with digitized research materials and big data. Dear colleagues, on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to warmly welcome you again next year to debate technology, society, and culture in the Eurasian space in Helsinki on the 23rd, 24th, and 25th of October. The call for papers will be published soon on the Aleksanteri website. Please stay in touch. And I was also asked by the organizers to make sure that everybody takes their personal belongings with them upon leaving this audience. Thank you very much. Thank you and see you in Helsinki.